Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves and Tweed, and welcome to a semi-historical tea session. Similarly to my historical tea session about the Duchess Anna and the invention of afternoon tea, today's historical tea session will be a little bit imprecise in terms of historical fact, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about the historical context of blooming and display teas. The people at Maya Luxurious Teas, which sells fine blooming teas and glass teaware, contacted me recently and offered to send me a set of their blooming tea balls and a set of teaware to best display them for this video to talk a little bit about blooming tea. Now, blooming tea is a very curious thing because there are people who claim that it goes back to the 10th century into the Song Dynasty, and there are those that claim that this was an invention of the 1980s and 90s. So first I'm going to get my little blooming tea ball steeping. I'm just going to snip this open. The ball itself is rather unassuming. It is hand-tied, made of green tea and flowers, but the flowers are inside. So you put that into your teapot, and you add some hot water. I like to add a little bit of water and let it sit for a few seconds to kind of soak up some of the water. And we'll just let that sit and bloom while we talk a little bit about blooming tea. So the idea that blooming tea goes back to the Song Dynasty probably has to do with the fact that the Song Dynasty is when tea as an aesthetic pursuit and as an art form really started coming into its own. While the Tang Dynasty text to the Classic of Tea by Lu Yu, which I've talked about before, is the first description of tea culture and the first known treatise that's really written about the preparation of tea and written by a very obvious connoisseur of tea. It was really the Song Dynasty when tea culture started becoming something that was done for fun, for the beauty of it, and for the beauty of the flavor of the tea, rather than simply for the medicinal purposes. And while tea was very much still a medicinal beverage and even had to compete with popular medicinal beverages even on a commercial scale, the idea of tea as something that was beautiful is something that very much came into its own in the Song Dynasty. And teas were given as gifts. They were given as favors in the royal court. So if you were favored by the emperor, you might be gifted a favor of tea. And the idea of tribute teas and teas that were processed in a special way as tribute for the emperor or as tribute that would be paid to high-ranking officials is something that started in the Song Dynasty. And these tea cakes had very evocative names. They were named after mythological beasts like dragons and phoenixes. They were named after flowers. They were named after natural phenomena and landscapes. And they were just given these artistic and poetic names, some of which are still used as inspiration for the names of some of these blooming tea balls. So this idea of tea as something that was displayed, of something that was of aesthetic value, really originated in the Song Dynasty, and perhaps that is what is meant by those who try to trace the history of blooming teas back to the idea of Song display teas. Now that said, there is very limited evidence for Song Dynasty teas that were tied together in flowers like blooming teas are today. And in fact, I talked to one friend of mine who owns a tea company, and he says that he doesn't really remember blooming teas coming onto the market before about 1998, although some trace it back to the 1980s. And I do think they were part of this late 20th century revitalization of tea culture and this kind of renaissance of Asian-inspired tea culture in the West that I think we owe a lot of thanks to companies like Adagio Teas and like Teavana for really making possible in the West and for introducing a lot of Westerners to the idea of world tea culture. So while Song Dynasty teas may have had flowery names and had aesthetic value and even been used as a form of currency, display, and art, they probably weren't the blooming teas that we know today. And I think that is a common thread in the history of tea, that while tea can trace its lineage back thousands of years, the tea of thousands of years ago is not what we drink today. And I think that a lot of people who think about tea as being a very ancient beverage and try to trace their tea's lineage back to this tradition from thousands of years ago forget that many of the tea practices and even the tea processing methods have only been developed in the last few hundred years or even the last 50 years in some cases. So it's not a bad thing that perhaps modern blooming teas are really only 30 or 40 years old, because tea is constantly evolving, and I think it's beautiful to have this tea that is a modern invention but can trace its aesthetic philosophy back to one of the early periods of tea's importance in Chinese culture. And I really do think the Song Dynasty typifies that idea of tea becoming an aesthetic pursuit, this idea that serving tea and making tea is an art form alongside the arranging of flowers or the appreciation of incense. So now that I've rambled on long enough, let's check on our tea. So you can see that over the 5 or so minutes that I rambled on about the historical context of this tea, the tea itself has bloomed into this lovely little flower arrangement, and it really does come into its own steeped in hot water, unlike many of the display teas of the Song Dynasty, which were probably not the best quality. Now the tea itself is flavored with jasmine and lily, and this does have roots in history, as floral flavors and floral scenting was very popular starting in the Song Dynasty. And in fact, they even would scent their teas with Borneo camphor, which is a practice that was a bit controversial, similar to scenting and flavoring teas today. So now I've poured myself a cup of this beautiful tea. It's a delicate kind of golden color. It looks a little bit like Chardonnay in this beautiful glass cup. So let's give it a taste. Now this has been steeping for 5 or 10 minutes. So it's been steeping for a very long time for green tea, and I used nearly boiling water. But it is not unpleasantly bitter. Now part of that might have something to do with the fact that I did use the full teapot of water, so it is a bit weak. You get this very light sweetness from the floral aromas, and you can smell them on the liquor. It's a very delicate cup of tea, and it has not gotten unpleasantly bitter. Oftentimes when you have these over-steeped flowering teas, they somehow manage to be both weak and bitter at the same time, but this is delicate and subtle. But the flavors that do come through are bright, a little bit juicy. It has a bit of a juicy mouthfeel. I will have to link the video that I did years ago for the Numi flowering tea, which was decidedly disappointing, and this is perhaps a counterpoint to that, which is a blooming tea that is both beautiful, easy to steep in a beautiful way, and quite tasty. So this was a video on the historical context of flowering and blooming teas, made possible by this generous gift from Maya Luxurious Teas, and I'll link their website below. I hope you enjoyed this semi-historical tea session, and I hope I see you again sometime. Thanks for watching. Bye.